Hello and welcome to the 1895 podcast with me, Tom, and joining me today is a very exciting guest, and that's Chris Huhne, former Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change in the UK, and is now serving as Chairman for the Anaerobic Digestion and Bioresources Association, or ADBA. For those unfamiliar with anaerobic digestion, or AD, in its simplest form, this is the process involving the breakdown of organic waste and producing biogas from that process, and we're going to get into some talk around that shortly. Now, on the podcast recently and across Gasworld, in fact, we've been covering the conflict that's currently ongoing in Iran, its consequences for the LNG and helium businesses, but it also calls into question the resilience of the gases supply chain to the UK and across Europe. We've seen costs soaring over the last couple of weeks in both oil and gas as well. And we're going to be talking about just that over the course of this podcast. So, Chris, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for joining me today for this conversation.
That's a pleasure.
Now, energy security has been a recurring theme in Europe. You know, we've had the Russia-Ukraine war for a number of years, and of course now we have this conflict in the Middle East, which we've been covering so closely for the last couple of weeks. So, from your point of view, just how exposed is Europe and the UK to an energy shock?
Well, the good news is that we are much less exposed than we were in previous energy shocks in the 1970s because of the growth of renewables. And obviously one of the key features of renewables, including biogas and biomethane, is that they are homegrown and therefore do not depend on volatile supplies from parts of the world that have got geopolitical challenges, shall we say. That doesn't entirely protect the European and the UK economies, because as the US is discovering, and indeed Canada, you can be an energy exporter and still have a real cost of living squeeze on most of your citizens, because even if you're a net energy exporter and you're not, as a country, particularly exposed to these energy shocks, there is the increase in price which comes about as a result of what's happening in the Gulf, both on liquefied natural gas, LNG cargoes from Qatar, and of course crude oil from the biggest oil field in the world, Ghawar in Saudi Arabia. That price shock communicates itself throughout the global economy, and that means that there is a transfer, even in an big oil and gas producer like US or Canada, from consumers to producers of oil and gas. That effect is made worse in Europe because, of course, Europe is a big importer of oil and gas, and that includes the UK now that the North Sea has largely, many of the reservoirs are depleted. So the economic impact in Europe, and particularly in Asia, which is even less able to provide its own energy, many of the Southeast Asian countries, Korea, Japan, the shock is going to be even bigger and will have an impact through probably a decline in the exchange rate against other currencies. So that shock is quite substantial. However, one important caveat to that is that in the 1970s, oil in particular was far more important relative to our overall output, our national income, than it is today. So the shock is going to be less. And I think a lot of people expected a lot of economists expected after the last crisis with the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the subsequent very sharp increase in gas prices in Europe, that there was going to be a recession. And there has indeed been a recession in the most industrial parts of Europe. Germany, notably, has completely flatlined as a result of this big energy price shock. But most of Europe has not. And I think it's an enormous difference. So the European economy as a whole has gone on growing. The world economy as a whole has gone on growing. And that's an enormously big difference to what happened after the two oil shocks in the 1970s. So I don't want to underestimate the effect, and particularly the cost of living squeeze. It's not going to be comfortable for anyone, but it is at least there is one consolation, which is that this oil and gas shock is I suspect unlikely to tip the whole of the European economy into recession. But there are big challenges, and clearly energy security and the ability of biogas to provide energy security is really important.
Absolutely, yeah. Thanks for that, Chris. And I think a lot of the focus has been on oil and the increase in the price of oil, but of course we have also seen that increase in the gas price, and because of the de facto closure of the Strait of Hormuz, which I'd like to get onto shortly. But
Yes, I mean, on that point, I think you're absolutely right. I think that, the old phrase is that generals tend to fight the last war. It's also true that economists and economic journalists tend to analyze the last crisis. And one of the things that has happened, we've talked already about the reduction in the overall importance of oil and gas relative to the 1970s shocks. But there's also been a shift from oil to gas. So one of the very noticeable effects in most European countries, and certainly in the UK, is that if you take account of the first round effect of gas price rises, they're actually more significant than oil price rises. So that is because gas is such an important element in our both industrial mix, but also, of course, residential heating. And in addition, it is the absolutely key fuel for a lot of our electricity generation. So it comes through both on the overall buying of gas, but also on electricity prices. And if you take both gas and electricity together, the importance in terms of the overall basket of what we spend, the consumer price basket that is measured by the normal inflation figures, it's actually about 60% bigger than diesel and petrol prices. So, the gas price is the thing to really watch because that is what is putting the big cost of living squeeze on in most of Europe.
And on the importance of gas, how important is domestically produced renewable gas, such as biomethane, to Europe's, I guess, long-term energy security?
Well, it's been getting much more significant in most European countries that are part of the European Union because, to its credit, the European Union produced a strategy once the Russians had invaded Ukraine, which was called Repower EU, and was designed to respond to the crisis in three ways. First of all, by energy saving. Secondly, by diversifying the supply of gas, which had come into Europe almost entirely through the pipelines from Russia towards liquefied natural gas, a lot of it from the US, and much of it indeed pumped initially through the UK because we had been importing a lot of LNG from Qatar and elsewhere already. So that third element of the pillar of the strategy to deal with the Russian crisis was biogas. And the European Commission encouraged the member states to build up the production of biogas and biomethane. And indeed, that has been happening very rapidly in a lot of countries. Perhaps the poster child on this is is France, where biomethane injection is now really quite dramatically higher than it was at the time of it's about double what it was at the time of the Russian invasion, and indeed has gone from virtually zero in 2016, 2017 to around 14 to 22 terawatt hours. So a really important increase. And the same is true in Italy, Denmark. Obviously, you're now in a situation whereby biomethane and biogas is responsible for about 40% of total gas use. So this is depending on the amount of national support and how seriously countries have taken the Commission's advice. You've seen a big shift towards the use of biogas and biomethane. There is one exception to this, I'm afraid, and that is, of course, a non-member state of the EU, the UK, which uniquely managed to produce an energy security white paper under a government which most of us would probably prefer to forget, under Mr. Johnson, Boris Johnson. And that energy security paper managed not to mention biogas or biomethane at all, and indeed skated over energy saving as well. So the UK has not built up that support. I think that there are encouraging signs that the current government in the UK has learnt, indeed, the lessons of the failure of the last government to respond adequately to the Russian gas crisis. And there was an extension of the green gas support scheme in the UK announced by the government in December, but more needs to be done. That said, we can actually build up pretty rapidly. So because of that rather lax attitude to energy security, in the UK, we're looking at about 7 terawatt hours of output of biomethane, which is frankly, is only 1% of total gas use in the UK. But we could build that up, which may be quite helpful next winter, to 9 terawatt hours without any increase in investment at all, providing that there is a sensible attitude towards support for the sector and some of the artificial constraints on the green gas support scheme and also some of the artificial regulatory constraints are removed. So we can do our bit as a sector. I wish it was larger, because if we'd been sensible like most other European countries, the ones that are within the European Union, we would have been building up the sector much more rapidly since the first gas crisis sparked by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But it is better late than never.
Sure. So we've seen investment across the EU, but I think the last few weeks has still shown how vulnerable the natural gas supply chain is to a geopolitical crisis. So do you think in this current situation that could accelerate investment even further in renewable gases?
I think it's inevitable that it is going to accelerate investment in all renewables and indeed in nuclear, although there are some supply chain problems there too. The key renewables, solar, offshore wind, onshore wind, and the uniquely valuable element of biomethane as a renewable resource which can be turned on and off quite easily and which is easily storable, so that in northern hemisphere countries it can provide backup for electricity generation when you don't have solar yield, which unfortunately in a lot of everywhere in northern Europe we don't have when we have peak demand for lighting and heating in December, January, February. There's no solar yield at all in the evening. So similarly with offshore wind, you can go for quite long periods without having adequate resource there. But if we have a proper renewable strategy which builds biomass, biogas and biomethane in line with solar and offshore wind, we can gradually reduce the vulnerability of the whole European energy system to these massive fossil fuel shocks. And I think that that's something that almost all sensible commentators that I've seen since the latest rises in oil and gas prices have been arguing. I think that we desperately need to accelerate the process of energy saving, the process of building up renewables right the way across the board, and particularly biogas and biomethane, because they're uniquely dispatchable characteristics. And of course, other ways of making us less dependent on these big price shocks emanating from whether it's the Middle East or from indeed from Russia.
Sure, and I would like to ask you about biomethane in a moment. Just one more on diversifying energy supply. You've of course worked in government as former Secretary of State for Energy and Climate in the UK government. But do you think that current policymakers have done enough? You mentioned the perhaps failings of the Boris Johnson administration. Do you think they've done enough since the hard lessons that we learned from the Russian gas crisis?
Well, I don't think we learned those hard lessons at the time. I think we're relearning them again now in the UK. I think that most European countries did better than we did. They probably wish they'd gone even further and even faster in building up biogas and biomethane in particular. And it's notable that even a country as relatively unaffected by this shock as France, because of its big fleet of nuclear reactors, is actually the poster child in building up biomethane, because it can see the advantages of having that dispatchable resource that can be turned on and off. So this, biomethane is a really important element of the total energy picture, and I think that's absolutely crucial. But in the UK, we need to have a long-term strategy. The government needs to have a biomethane target. It needs to recognize the capacity that we have as a sector in the UK to get up to about 120 terawatt hours from our domestic resources of feedstock. So we can actually produce 120 terawatt hours, which, given that the total gas demand is 700 terawatt hours, and that's gradually going to come down by common consent as, for example, more heating goes towards electric heat pumps. The reality is we could be meeting at least half of long-run gas demand from biomethane, and that's something that at the moment you're seeing only in some really forward-thinking countries like Denmark. So we've got to think further about pushing the sector and really making sure that we've taken away the obstacles to its growth in the planning system, and that the Secretary of State is able to accelerate some really big-scale biomethane plants, because it will be the key factor which will insulate us from these sort of fossil fuel shocks.
And on the note of growth and scaling up, how do UK and EU ambitions and targets compare? And are we on track with those, do you know?
Well, we still haven't had in the UK an official new estimate of what the government thinks long-run feedstock availability will be able to support in terms of biomethane output. In the sector, with the work that was commissioned by the Green Gas Task Force from Alder BioInsights, we now have a really solid, detailed study which shows that the UK feedstock availability could support 120 terawatt hours of biomethane. And that's a really important benchmark. But remember, the government is still stuck on a very old, very outdated, and frankly indefensible number, which is about 30 to 35 terawatt hours, a fraction of what we are now convinced could be the sector potential. In other countries, remember that the UK is simply not one of the big agricultural powerhouses. If you look at the potential for biomethane in the really big agricultural countries in Europe like France and Poland, it's enormous. This is a really crucial fuel precisely because it's so easy to store in the gas grid and then also in natural geological formations. In our case, for example, old North Sea gas fields, which kept fossil gas in place for millions of years, can be very easily repurposed, as we've already done with the Rough facility in the North Sea, to store gas. And then we can store it all year round as we produce it from biomethane plants and then bring it out when we really need it in December, January, February. And there is no other way of doing this. There's never going to be a battery cheap enough that you can charge up from solar energy in June and then keep it without discharging it or recharging it again until January. It's just not going to happen. So biomethane is in many ways the big green battery, as the Danes call it. And they're absolutely right. It's the capacity to store biomethane and bring it out when we need it in December, January, February that is its absolutely key magic quality.
And you mentioned the agriculture market there, Chris. We've heard reports and rumblings in the last few days that fertilizer and agricultural costs are rising alongside that global spike in energy prices. You're chairman at the minute of ADBA, the Anaerobic Digestion and Bioresources Association. So, just how can anaerobic digestion provide stability for those sectors as well?
Well, it's absolutely crucial that the end product that comes out of a biomethane plant, which is biofertiliser, is actually used instead of synthetic fertilizer. The reason why synthetic fertilizer prices have gone through the roof is because it is made principally from fossil gas through the Haber-Bosch process, and that turns it into a usable fertilizer, which is absolutely crucial to global agriculture, frankly. But we need to move to a situation, again, where we protect our farming industry from this immense price shock which they're now facing. I mean, a load of farmers now complaining that they're simply, not going to be able to make money if they actually have fertilizer costs going through the roof as they have been over the last couple of weeks, precisely because these fertilizer costs effectively reflect the fossil gas cost. And if we can instead use biofertilizer as it comes out of biomethane plants, I think that's an absolutely brilliant solution to the problem. And at the moment, farmers are used to using synthetic fertilizer. It's bagged up, it's ready, it's already produced to common specifications. And frankly, we need to do more in the industry, and the government needs to help do more, particularly DEFRA, the department concerned principally with farming, needs to help us do more to help farmers use biofertilizer. Last time, when there was a really big increase in the cost of synthetic fertilizer in the wake of the Russian gas crisis, farmers did indeed switch to using biofertilizer out of anaerobic digestion plants, out of biomethane plants. But they often slipped back when the price came down again. And we have to actually now get into a position where this becomes the default use of fertilizer for British farming, because it will protect British farming against the sort of shock which it's facing now with synthetic fertilizer prices.
And if you were in government right now, or perhaps what you are doing from your position as chairman at ADBA, what would you be asking this government to do?
Well, I think the key thing, I mean, we can help as a sector, the government respond to this, because I mean, I'm very worried, frankly, that we could see quite a long-running crisis here. I mean, I hope, obviously, like everybody else, that, and as President Trump claims, that this could all be over in a matter of days or weeks, and we'll be back to normal. But frankly, I think it makes sense from a policy point of view to hope for the best, but to prepare for the worst. And the worst scenario is that this goes on, closing the Straits of Hormuz and having a very major impact on the fossil gas price as a result. Because although there is some workaround for Saudi oil production through a pipeline that can load tankers in the Red Sea, so probably the Saudis can export around 5 million barrels a day of oil, compared with maybe what they're doing at before this crisis of about 7 million barrels a day. But for gas, it's much, much more difficult. There isn't the same easy workaround. All of those big carriers, LNG carriers, have to pass through the Straits of Hormuz and dock in Qatar and take off the liquefied natural gas from Qatar and then go back through the Straits of Hormuz. And if I, frankly, was a ship owner, I would not be risking a big LNG carrier in those circumstances, because they're much more sophisticated and expensive pieces of equipment than a very large crude oil tanker. They have to have refrigeration. The gas, to keep it liquefied, has to be kept at a very, very low temperature. So the insurance costs for carriers, for gas carriers, have been soaring. So this is potentially a much longer run crisis for the gas world than it is for the oil world. And that's another way in which I think both policymakers and analysts and economic journalists need to get with what's been happening with the shift to LNG, because we've become much more dependent on LNG. It's much more significant for the cost of living in European countries, and it's much more vulnerable now because the price shock of Qatar not being able to export the LNG through the Straits of Hormuz.
Thanks, Chris. Now, I could talk to you about this all afternoon, but I've got to let you go. So, one final question.
Yeah.
We've spoken a lot about energy security and the role that this industry can play in that. But beyond that, what role or potential role does anaerobic digestion play in Europe's various emissions targets and essentially as a climate solution?
Well, the long run aim, obviously, of European energy systems must be to get to net zero. And one of the great advantages of biomethane production is that when you get a raw biogas from your feedstock, and the digester has mixed it and the raw biogas comes out, it's principally composed of two gases. One is the methane, which is a complete substitute for fossil gas. And the other thing that you're capturing is CO2, carbon dioxide. And this carbon dioxide is essentially coming out of the organic feedstock stream that has gone into the anaerobic digester, into the biomethane plant. And that means that you're actually capturing CO2 from the organic biocycle, the eco-cycle. And this is the cheapest way of capturing CO2 and actually removing CO2 from the atmosphere of any of the options that are currently under consideration that involved engineered solutions. So I think that that's an enormous advantage for biomethane. If you can capture the CO2 and store it, you, in the process of doing biomethane output, then you are actually creating a net negative. You're withdrawing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. You're going more net negative in terms of emissions than any other process. And that in turn gives you a bit more leeway in aiming for net zero, which is, of course, the balance of negative and positive emissions of greenhouse gases. It gives you more leeway to persist with some really hard to abate technologies, whether it's with aircraft aviation emissions or whether it's maritime emissions, whatever it happens to be. The point is that by going negative with biomethane, the more biomethane you have, the more negative you can go on emissions, the more room you have to be able to meet net zero, even with some really hard to replace technologies that you can't get rid of. So it has an enormous advantage for net zero. And the modeling work which we did at ADBA last year, looking at this, suggested that you roughly doubled the negative emissions of the system as a whole by building biomethane up to its full potential. And that in turn, of course, means that you have very substantial cost savings in the transition to net zero, because you don't have to immediately replace a load of things that otherwise would be emitting. And the cost savings which we estimated for UK households were running at £400 every year through to net zero in 2050. So this is a really significant amount of money, which the Treasury should be looking at very seriously. So I think that the longer run picture is that building up biomethane in response to the crisis is a good thing from an energy security point of view, but the long run outlook is that it also is completely no regrets option, precisely because it gives you more wiggle room, more headroom to meet your net zero targets in the long run.
Fantastic. Thank you, Chris. Some great analysis there. And what an exciting industry this biomethane space is.
It certainly is. And it needs to grow. I mean, it is already, I think, on the IEA numbers, the second fastest growing renewable after solar. And I, very firmly believe it's going to go on growing very rapidly, precisely because the process is so interesting for the whole objective of getting to net zero and for energy security. And so, frankly, we have the ability to reach out to allies right the way across the political spectrum, whether you are, on the left and the greenie who's really concerned about tackling climate change, or whether you're somebody who doesn't believe in climate change at all, but doesn't want to see our national sovereignty undermined by excessive reliance on geopolitical hotspots like the Straits of Hormuz. On the right, this is a technology which actually is made for the entire political spectrum.
Fantastic. Well, thanks for your time, Chris. I'll let you carry on.
That's a pleasure. Okay, Tom, thanks a lot.